Now we'll talk about estrogen breakthrough bleeding. That the best clinical example of estrogen, the best clinical examples of estrogen breakthrough bleeding are the different pattern of bleeding that is observed in women with chronic anovulation. Okay, remember the estrogen breakthrough bleeding are the different patterns of bleeding that observed in women with chronic anovulations. The amount of bleeding and the duration of estrogen breakthrough bleeding, how much amount, how long the duration of the bleeding can vary widely depending on the amount and duration of on-off estrogen. The amount and duration of bleeding, the estrogen breakthrough bleeding, can vary widely depending on the amount and duration of on-off estrogen stimulation that the endometrium has received. So remember, the amount of bleeding, the duration of estrogen breakthrough bleeding, it will vary widely. It will depend upon the amount and duration of the on-off estrogen stimulation that endometrium has received. How much on-off estrogen and how much duration it has received, that will that will tell what duration, what amount of estrogen breakthrough bleeding all occur further. So if there will be relatively low level of chronic estrogen exposure, okay, if it's very relatively low level of chronic exposure, typically resulting intermittent spotting or staining that is generally light in volume but may be prolonged. Okay, so if there will be relatively low level of chronic estrogen exposure, typically resulting intermittent spotting or staining that is generally light in volume but maybe it can be prolonged. But in contrast, if there will be sustained high level of estrogen stimulation, commonly results in long intervals of amenorrhea punctuated by acute episodes of profuse bleeding that vary in durations, can be severe enough to necessitate emergent care. So remember, estrogen breakthrough bleeding, what are the clinical example? Estrogen breakthrough bleedings are different patterns of bleeding observed in women with chronic anovulation. The amount and duration of the estrogen breakthrough bleeding, it will vary widely. It will depend upon the amount and duration of on-off estrogen stimulation that endometrium has received. If relatively low level of chronic estrogen exposure typically result in intermittent spotting or staining that is generally light in volume but may be prolonged. In contrast, if sustained high level of estrogen stimulation commonly result in long interval of amenorrhea punctuated by acute episode of heavy profuse bleeding that vary in durations, can severe enough to necessitate emergent care. So remember that there will be estrogen withdrawal bleeding, estrogen breakthrough bleeding. In estrogen withdrawal bleeding, what are the example? In estrogen withdrawal bleeding, you can compare estrogen withdrawal bleeding. There is three example. One clinical example, estrogen breakthrough bleeding is that which may follow after bilateral oophorectomy during the follicular phase. The bleeding that occur after removal of the ovaries, that one example, that can be delayed by excess in estrogen therapy, then if you stop, then will bleed. Other example is cyclic estrogen only hormone therapy in a castrate or postmenopausal women. Another example is mid-cycle bleeding that can accompany a transient but abrupt fall in estrogen level. Mid-cycle bleeding, what happens before and after ovulation? There will be a transient fall, transient time, some less time, but abrupt fall in estrogen level for a very small time, that is before and after ovulation, so that leads to mid-cycle bleeding. Remember, these are the three example of estrogen withdrawal bleeding. First one is bilateral oophorectomy in the follicular phase. Second one is estrogen only hormone therapy, cyclic estrogen only hormone therapy in a castrated postmenopausal woman, and the mid-cycle bleeding due to transient abrupt fall in the estrogen level in before and after ovulations. This is estrogen withdrawal. What is breakthrough? The breakthrough bleeding is the clinical examples are the estrogen withdrawal pattern of bleeding in the chronic anovulation patients. The amount and duration of the bleeding will depend on the how much time and how much duration of on-pause estrogen stimulation that endometrium has received. If there will be a relative low level of chronic estrogen exposure that lead to typically intermittent spotting or staining that is generally light in volume, but it may be prolonged. But in contrast, if there will be a sustained high level, constantly high level of estrogen for a long interval time, for prolonged durations, high level estrogen stimulation commonly result in a prolonged long interval of amenorrhea followed by acute episode of heavy profuse bleeding that vary in duration, severity, that severe enough to necessitate an emergency care. That is example, estrogen breakthrough bleeding is a typical example of PCOS patient, low level estrogen, chronic low level estrogen, through intermittent spotting or staining, or it can be high level estrogen, sustained high level estrogen stimulation commonly result in long interval of amenorrhea followed by acute episode of profuse bleeding. The very duration can severe enough to necessitate the emergency care.